We are very happy to welcome two international guests here today, and very happy to see lots of students and also colleagues. So thanks for coming along to hear our speakers first of all, and also a very warm welcome to our two speakers. Our first speaker is going to be, we have two, and they're going to just divide their time up, and I'm going to introduce them both, and then they'll take it away, and then of course we'll have questions at the end and a nice cup of tea and some lamingtons for our Canadian guests to introduce them to them if they haven't had lamingtons yet. Quite important experience, I think. Our first speaker is Professor Nicholas Terpstra, who's from the University of Toronto, but he's also really an international ambassador, I would say, for Renaissance and Reformation studies. At the formal level, he does this ambassadorial role really as articles editor of the premier journal in the field, Renaissance Quarterly. But at the informal level, I would say he knows it very well how to share a drink and a chat with young, old, and everyone in between to talk history, to talk ideas, and do the job of thinking about the past as a way also to ennoble our own characters and societies in the very present. And he does it so well, and he often does it, sometimes in my company as well, at a lovely place called Villa Tatti, where he's been visiting professor on a number of occasions. Villa Tatti, the Harvard University Centre for Italian Renaissance Studies, just outside of Florence. So his work specifically is on the social history of Renaissance and early modern Italy. He looks at the intersections of gender, politics, religion and charity in urban societies. He's working on a monograph now on exiles and refugees in early modern Europe. He's got a number of books that have all had a very big impact on our field. Cultures of Charity, Women, Politics and the Reform of Poor Relief in Renaissance Italy, that was with Harvard 2013. And Lost Girls, Sex and Death in Renaissance Florence, a 2010 publication. I think one of his signature volumes as well, Lay Confraternities and Civic Religion in Renaissance Bologna. He's edited also a number of collections of essays, another testament to his very collaborative working style. That will be, Professor Terpstra will speak to us first, and second, apparently to wake us all up, I'm not sure, this is what I've been told, Gary Waite's going to take over, and he's going to show some very interesting images. Apparently we've got to try and look out for the Holy Spirit being depicted in very unusual ways, but I'm not sure if that's a spoiler. Gary Waite is from the University of New Brunswick. Right, very far east. It's a beautiful part of
it. It is. It's beautiful, friendly.
Yeah.
Not so rich.
Yeah, right. Just north of Maine, so yeah. Very, very interesting spot. He works on the Continental Reformation, in particular 16th century Netherlands and Germany. He's particularly interested in marginal groups in the period, Anabaptists, witches, and non-Christians living in Europe, so very interesting work. His books include Reformers on the Stage, Popular Drama and Religious Propaganda in the Low Countries of Charles V. That was with Toronto in 2000, and Heresy, Magic and Witchcraft in Early Modern Europe, another very interesting looking book. And his current project is The Religious Other in 17th Century Europe, Christians, Jews and Muslims. So we'll really look forward to that coming out as well. I've taken too long already, so now I'll hand over to our speakers.
Well, welcome. And thanks to all of you for coming. When Gary and I were driving up here, we were comparing notes where we are. If it was the Friday, end of term, beginning of a long weekend, we wouldn't even show up. So you're heroic, and we are very grateful for that heroism. So we also wanted to thank the organizers of the ARC History of Emotions project and the Feeling Exclusion conference that brought us here in Melbourne, brought us here last week. So after that we were able to then, I got in touch with Camilla, and she very graciously thought she could, twist a few arms to bring the audience here, and we're very, very grateful for you coming. So Gary and I have both been working on things having to do with exile, emotions, Reformation, and we have then two projects that in a sense work together. I'll first talk about in a sense the overarching picture, and then with my reference to my project, you feel the jet lag is still here. I cannot find my words. I'm sorry, I left them somewhere on the M1. And then Gary's got something more particular about the images and emotions, and a particular reformer, David York. So the collaboration we had a few years ago started around a conference on exiles and refugees in the early modern period. And out of that conference, which we held in Toronto a couple of years ago, Gary's edited a collection of essays, and I'm working on a monograph, which Camilla just mentioned, that's tentatively titled Exile, Expulsion, and Religious Refugees in the Early Modern Period. And what I'm trying to do is offer a different way of looking at the Reformation and how we might conceive it, how we might see relations within it. So, I hope you'll be interested in this kind of amuse-bouche about the project. It actually started as a challenge a few years ago to write a textbook for grade 6 students. So we're talking about 12-year-olds, and to write a textbook then about the Reformation. Now, when I started thinking about this, about doing it, and I started thinking, what would grade 6 students want to read? Would they want to know about justification by faith? Would they want to know about sola scriptura or prevenient grace? I really didn't think so. I thought, these are going to be very young students. Thought of some of the students that we have living around Toronto in the suburbs, largely from a non-Christian background, little background in the concepts of the Reformation, little investment in it personally in any way. Many migrants. I was thinking of the suburbs. We have a very large Somali, Tamil, South Asian population. So I was trying to think, what is going to be in the dynamics of the period that might in some way speak to them? And so how do we, in a sense, as historians, bridge between the material we have and the readers that we have to reach out to? And what I thought the bridge that might be most effective was looking at their position as immigrants and often as refugees. And at this point, Heiko Obermann, a very prominent historian of the Reformation, had been writing about Calvin as a refugee theologian, not simply a theologian who was a refugee, but that the refugee experience really shaped his way of thinking about theology, thinking about the church. And that grew into the opportunity then to reconceptualize, think about Calvin, but then think about everybody else. And think about how we might use this refugee experience. If we foreground the refugee experience, what does the background look like? What does the middle ground look like? How do we actually see other relationships differently? And that then grew into an opportunity to rethink and reconceptualize the Reformation more generally. Now, Europe had long been a persecuting society. R.I. Moore in 1987 writes The Formation of a Persecuting Society. He talks about the movements of the 10th to 13th century. And I'm not trying to redate what Moore did, but what I thought was important is that what's different in what we could call the long Reformation of the early modern period, is that exile and expulsion really become much more widespread, and they're often driven by or legitimated by religious reasons. And the religious refugee then becomes a mass phenomenon. We're talking then about now not simply a handful of people being moved out, but hundreds of thousands of people being moved out, and recreating or reshaping the map of Europe as a result, and to some extent even the global map. So I wanted to talk about 3 points then. If we look at this refugee experience as the window through which we look at the Reformation generally, how might we view the period and the dynamics of the period? And emotions do get in. You haven't been brought here under false pretenses. The emotions will arrive. But first we look at a few other things. And I wanted to focus particularly on 3: scope, periodization, and the intellectual framework. And by focusing on reformations, by focusing on expulsions, one of the things I thought that was very important, thinking again of these grade 6 students, is that it actually allows you to look at the Reformation as something that's more than just an in-house fight between Christians that produces the Protestant and the Catholic churches. actually the Jewish and the Muslim expulsions from Europe become fundamental. They're prior to the various expulsions that happen within, say Christian Europe north of the Alps. You're also able to draw in Hindu and Muslim communities, particularly in India. There's a lot of examples of forced baptisms by Portuguese settlers, which then result in a whole range of problems there. Also, Aboriginal communities in North and South America. They're also drawn into religious fights. They often suffer dislocation or relocation as a result of that. And so just at that level of scope, it seemed to me that if we look at refugees and focus on the refugee experience, we're going to be looking at something that actually speaks to a broader range of people, and a broader range of people can see themselves in the narrative and can see that in a sense it has some impact on them directly. But then that's the second thing, moves into the second question, which has to do with periodization. And I think that if we focus on refugees, then the periodization of the Reformation shifts. We're going to go further back into the past, into the 15th century, and we're going to go further up into the 18th century. So it's really the long Reformation in a very extended way. And that means that we begin not with the traditional markers, the traditional starting points of Reformation in theological discontent in Germany, but actually begin with the accelerating expulsion of Jews from German towns, from French towns, and then ultimately from Iberia in 1492 and 1497. And these Iberian expulsions then become the critical and even you could say the defining events that, if anything, trigger this broader issue, broader movement called Reformation. And then continuing on with periodization, we can see then three cascading waves that come out after that. In a sense, each wave bigger than the last. So the first wave, a relatively small scale of expulsions, going to about the 1550s. This might be the expulsion or the flight, the exile of individuals, of dozens of peoples, perhaps hundreds of people. Often still critical and influential, but relatively small numbers. When you think of within English church history, the Marian exiles are seen as a really critical group. There's only about 800 of them. It's not a large group. They're quite influential, and that's part of the point here. It doesn't have to be a lot of people to be an influential group within a church or within society. So if that first wave takes us to the 1550s, it's really more about it's often linked to individual religious issues, matters of conscience, new framings of doctrine. By the second stage, which I would take to be, say, from about the 1550s to roughly 1600, it's becoming more political, and we get the mobilization of more political issues and political states as well. So one of the key things in here is the Dutch Civil War, and so the movement of refugees in and out of Holland. There's Dutch Catholic refugees that leave and come back and leave again and come back. And then there's also the Dutch Protestant refugees, the Calvinists, who come up from Antwerp into the Netherlands and really reshape the northern Netherlands. And there's also other similar kinds of expulsions around in Eastern Europe and movements in Eastern Europe. And then the third is really the biggest one, and this I think would be one of the greatest surprises. I mean, with my reconfiguring of the Reformation, actually the 15th century and the 17th century become more important. And the 16th century is not quite a sideshow, but it's just not quite as significant, let's say. So this third stage, from 1600 into the 18th century, is when things really take on quite enormous scale. 300,000 Muslims exiled from Iberia between 1609 and 1614. Then from 1620 to 40, 21,000 Puritans going to America. Some of them exiles, some of them voluntary migrants, but also moving for religious reasons. 30 Years' War, 1618 to 48. 75% of the population of Württemberg disappears. Half of the population of Brandenburg. Large-scale devastation in Bohemia, really across Germany, the Holy Roman Empire. Moving into the 1630s and 40s in Ireland, there's the English government moves 125,000 settlers to settle in parts of Ireland, sparking a rebellion in 1641. Cromwell's conquest of 1649 to 53 kills, out of a population estimated at about 1.4 million, kills about 600,000, deports another 50,000. Catholics before that exercise had owned about 60% of the land. Afterwards, they owned about 8%. And it's seen by many historians as really perhaps the first example of ethno-religious cleansing, ethnic cleansing of the kind that we're familiar with, say, from the Balkans in the 1990s. And seen by many people also as really an early example of religious genocide. One thing we're very familiar with, the about 200,000 Huguenots exiled from France after the revocation of Edict Nantes. Then what sometimes surprises people, I find, is people aren't aware that in the 1730s, 1731-32, there's 20,000 Protestants exiled from the area around Salzburg, and whole parishes around the city of Salzburg are completely emptied out. And this is pushed by the Bishop of Salzburg. A lot of them end up going to Prussia. And again, the interesting thing about this is that Austria, which we now think of as almost a paradigmatically Catholic nation, had for a good part of the latter 16th and early 17th century, had been really largely Protestant. And then because I'm, that would be in a sense the last one, but because I'm Canadian, I also then draw in a sense the final one of these mass movements, the 11,500 Acadians who are exiled from the Maritimes, from the Canadian Maritimes in 1755. And that's perhaps about the largest, or the last of large state expulsions at that time. I mean, colonial powers do move people around after that, but this is one of the last large ones that's really closely linked to religious identity. Not solely religious identity, but still largely around that. So to sum up that thing about periodization, then, if we're going to look at expulsions and see them as the characteristic, we really have to start moving back, as I say, into the 15th century, and then onward into the mid-18th century, and see then that there is this arc of expulsions, which is quite critical to European development. And this is one of the other things when this idea first started coming to me. I was actually thinking also about some of the holocausts of the 20th century. And one of the things to bear in mind with this kind of periodization too is that we think of the term Holocaust in 20th century terms. Many of the communities that are forcibly relocated or eliminated in the 20th century owe their origins to this first wave of expulsions that I'm talking about in the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. So the movements of Jewish populations, the movements of Mennonite populations, the movements of Muslim populations, a little less so there, but certainly a lot of the Jewish populations are first put into motion in the 15th century, settle down and live in new areas for about 300 years, and then in the early 20th century it's those same communities that are assaulted by the Nazis. So there's an arc to this development that I'm talking about. If that's the case, then, if we want to foreground the refugee experience, do we start thinking about doctrines differently? Do we start reinterpreting religious doctrines? I mean, I mentioned sola scriptura and prevenient grace and all of these. Does that just disappear? I don't think so, but I do think it shifts, and in the moves that we make, we might reconsider what some doctrines mean and what underlies them. And so in this third area of intellectual framework, I really want to look at two things: doctrine itself and what we could call the imaginary. And this is really where the emotions enter in. What I've tried to do in the book as I've developed it is, and I should just say again, my ideal reader for this book is a second-year undergraduate student who, say, possibly comes from a completely different culture, could be a Tamil student or an Asian student, who has no background in Christianity. And I'm trying then to explain the period and its religious dynamics without relying too much on formal doctrinal terminology. It's a bit of a challenge, but so this one chapter is where I focus on it particularly. And I hope it works. We'll see. But what I've tried to do then is step back from immediate formulations of doctrine and think about some of the things underlying doctrine which might drive it. And in this case, I focus on three things: purity, contagion, and purgation or separation. And it seems to me that these are three of the drivers: purity, contagion, and purgation, separation. Three of the drivers for theological developments of the time. And we can really link them up to different emotional values as well. That purity really relates to hope, contagion to fear, and purgation and separation to what we might call charitable hatred, which I'll expand on in a bit. So this is really where the emotions start to enter in. And what I've tried to do then is say take some of the doctrinal innovations of the period, looking at, and Gary will expand on this, the doctrines of the radicals and the Anabaptists. They're associated with some of their central doctrines are things like the adoption of adult baptism, believers' baptism. And in relation to that, the idea of creating a pure community, a holy community, which is protected, in a sense disciplined by the band, and also then of the band being a form of discipline where you're ostracized from the community if you violate its norms. And then in some cases often also operates for or opts for a form of separatism. This is why many of at least some groups within the Anabaptist, on the Anabaptist spectrum move out into rural areas and want to be separated on their own. So I tried to introduce or look at these as outworkings of those dynamics of purity, contagion, and purgation or separation. For the Calvinists, one of the things that becomes really important is, of course, election. This idea that God elects or chooses a community, that he chooses a pure community, which has to then also protect itself from contagion, and so which also exercises a fairly high level of purgation and separation from others. And then with Lutherans, with others, in a sense, a more common Reformation boilerplate, the idea of sola scriptura, really adopted by pretty much all Reformation groups to some form or another. And what I've seen is that sola scriptura, and what I try to do in the book is describe it really as a tool driving radical purification or radical simplification that purges and purifies Christianity. For many of that first generation of reformers, sola scriptura is the single litmus test, and it's the thing that allows them then to purge doctrine, purge ecclesiology, and really in a certain sense, if you want to think of it this way, they are sending Catholicism into exile, by which I mean that in towns and in communities, they send the saints into exile, they send the priests into exile, they send really, they purge all of Catholicism and its extraordinary structure. So it seems to me, again, since I'm trying to explain theological doctrines to a group of people who won't have much familiarity with it, trying to find a way of using the language that gets at the dynamics of the period and explains what happens. Why are people doing what they're doing at this time? Why are they purging so much? This is where, again, like I say, the emotions come in. Love and hate, in a sense, as flip sides of each other. And then what I mentioned earlier, charitable hatred, which is the title of a book by Alexander Walsham. And she really, it's an old concept that goes back certainly to biblical texts, also Tertullian and all the rest. This idea that, I don't do you any favor by tolerating your error. And so that if you are in error, the most charitable thing I can do to you is to hate the sin and to correct you. This will hurt, okay? But it will only hurt temporarily. Your space in eternity will be fine. So charitable hatred really drives an enormous amount of what's going on at this time. And what I've tried to, as I've tried to develop it, one thing I won't develop really here so much, but look at it also as a way of handling the poor, because what I also do is look at treatment of the poor and orphans and the rest. And the charity sometimes comes up in areas of protection as well, that I am doing this in order to protect you from things that are worse. So a flip side of expulsion, or the alternate to expulsion, might be something like enclosure, separation of groups. And so within the book I have one chapter that looks both at forms of expulsion, but then also forms of enclosure, things that include then the ghetto, the workhouse, the poorhouse. All of these as efforts, again, to somehow separate a group which might be alien, which might be contagious, which might be not entirely pure, either to purify them or to keep pure the rest of society. So that's, in a sense, some of doctrine. Then moving into the imaginary, which is, I'd say, is a much more fun chapter to write, or much more fun part of the chapter to write. Because then what you're looking at is how do people populate an imaginary world which they have just completely devastated. Again, think of the Catholic imaginary replete with saints, replete with rituals, replete with certain ways of understanding the space of worship and the place of worshipers. There is the radical simplification, but then there also has to be a way in which those spaces, those empty spaces, are filled. And so Protestants eliminate the saints as intercessory. They still keep them as models in many cases, but they replace them with an extraordinary range of Protestant martyrologies. And one of the things to look at is the literature that comes up then, because we have to make sure that our children maintain the new faith that we've established. So we have the martyrologies. We have the use of Jewish and Old Testament narratives, the use of covenant theology. The Exodus experience comes in extraordinarily. The type of Egypt that we, going into exile, the thing we have to decide for ourselves: are we the children of Israel leaving Egypt, or are we the Israelites going into Babylon? And this is the interesting thing that comes up in all of this literature, and it's used by both. The Huguenots, when they are sent out after 1685, often see themselves as going into Babylon. They have erred. The edict of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes is punishment by God for their sins. They will return, but only if they purify themselves. So this fills their imaginary. They adopt exile in some cases as righteous punishment for themselves, or in the case of the Puritans, as a move to the promised land. You know, if I see myself as leaving Egypt, then there's a different sense in which the imaginary fills my experience. And one of the things that's very characteristic, I think, about the Puritans in America is that Puritan experience becomes definitive for a broad range of the population, even though there's only about 20,000 Puritans who ever go over, and most of them go for economic reasons. And yet they develop an imaginary which establishes religious persecution in England as the thing which drove them forward, looking for a new Jerusalem. And the rhetoric, if anything, builds in the exile experience and really frames the fundamental part of American civic religion. What I can't really do so much in this lecture, but certainly in the book, is look also at other communities. So, for instance, this is also the time when in Jewish communities the Esther story becomes much more important, and the celebration of Purim becomes much more elaborate. More plays, more open celebration, things like that. So I'm conscious of the time here. Just to recap or sum up, the points then is if we foreground exile, expulsion, and the refugee experience, we, I think, expand the scope of Reformation to bring Jews and Muslims to the core of the narrative, not just to the margins. We shift the periodization, as I said, back to the 15th, ahead to the 18th. And we emphasize then, we start looking at doctrine a different way, emphasizing purity, contagion, and purgation, and looking at how closely they work in with religious and political goals. And what I try to develop in a longer version of this in the book is how these discourses then merge into the discourses around patriotism and nationalism. And they legitimate the large-scale forced movements of populations for quite a long time. So it's not necessarily a rejection of past interpretations, but the other image I've tried to give to people is that we've always looked at the Reformation through a certain window, or we've often looked at it through a certain window. And so we imagine looking into a house through a window, seeing the room, seeing where the chairs are, seeing where people are standing, seeing where the table is. I'm inviting you to turn around to the side of the house and look in another window. Same chairs, same people, same carpet, but you're looking at them in a different way. And you see a different set of connections. You see different relations. You see a different side of people. And I think that's one thing that we do naturally as historians. Certainly that's what other people have done with the Reformation. Karl Marx's interpretation was in a sense, as much an invitation to look in a different window. Although he actually really wanted you to look into the basement and the attic as well. And Marx was much more radical than me. But it's the narrative then for this generation, and I think that's one of the things I try to tell my students, that at a certain level, history is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, and it's then the way we understand ourselves in a broader narrative. And I think, again, going back to these students that I was thinking of, many of them are not voluntary migrants, but they are migrants, and migration forces them, shapes their experience. The interesting thing that I found is that many of the students who've really responded to this have been students who come into my Reformation history class from completely a broad range of backgrounds. I get a lot of Muslims in my Reformation class wanting to understand what it is that makes Christians tick, because they can't figure it out. And they figure they don't want to go to a religious studies class, they want to study it historically, and I think they understand that this is a key period. So what we're trying to do here is that take something that's been central, say, to European experience, look at it in a different way so that we can also explain it differently to others and ourselves. Thanks a lot for your patience.
Now Gary's going to pick you up. Thank you for coming. Thanks, Camilla, for organizing this. This is my first time in your absolutely fabulous country. Wonderful campus. Gosh, it's just great. I come, the part of Canada that I come from, New Brunswick, has got lots of trees, but they're very different trees, and they shed all their leaves in the winter, and it gets snow and stuff. So this is very different. This is not winter. Anyway, I'm going to sort of move from the broad approach that Nick has provided here, and focus more narrowly on one particular case study of an individual who's part of the Radical Reformation movement that Nick has already mentioned. One of the groups that was most severely persecuted in the first half of the 16th century, driven out of homes. In some cases, as we'll see, not only were they driven out by persecution, but also apocalyptic excitement caused thousands of them to try to move to the place where they believed, sincerely it seems, that Christ was going to return. So this is essentially a portion of the paper from the Melbourne History of Emotions and Exile conference. But in question time, I can both Nick and I will be happy to explore the bigger ramifications of these things. And if I put the glasses down, I can actually see what I'm doing. Which is a good thing, because you don't want me blathering on and on and on. Now, I'm a specialist in the history of religious persecution, exile in the early modern era. When asked to consider presenting a paper on the history of emotions, I said, well, I know nothing about that, but that gives you the opportunity to learn. And one of the things that I did, I thought I initially was going to write the experience of the Anabaptists and the martyr books and the traditions and the stories and documents, thousands of these things in broad terms. But I focused instead on a fellow that I thought was familiar, and a set of sources that I thought were familiar to me, but now with an eye to where does emotion fit in. And I discovered that this looking at history from this perspective gave me a completely different take, a new take on familiar sources. The Reformation was not just a battle over ideas. The Reformation was a deeply emotional event where passions rose up from all sides, not just among the Anabaptists, but also from Catholics and Lutherans. We know a lot about Luther and the feelings that he had. He was fearful of the devil, fearful of death. He loved his dear Katie. These are the things we know about. But for most of the Reformation characters, we know very little about how they felt. So I went back to a document that I thought I had done with, the biography of the fellow that you'll see in a moment, David Joris, because here we have someone who is driven from his home. He endures horrific persecution. Hundreds of his supporters and friends and associates are captured, arrested, and executed. Many of them executed for not telling the authorities where David Joris was. He was an Anabaptist leader. He was trained as an artist, which you'll see gives him a very different perspective on matters. We know more famously about the English Puritans and the kind of emotions that they had, agonizing process, am I a member of the elect? And this led to feelings of despair and suicide on their part, as well as joy when they have a moment when they think they are actually among the elect. I discovered when I went back to this biography, which was written, I believe, by a very close friend of Joris, probably with Joris's assistance. Probably this is something of an autobiography. And I found that Joris too struggled with these kinds of emotions, but for very different reasons. Joris's emotions were driven by, and his program, the spiritual examination, which has many parallels with that of English Puritans, was driven by external pressures of persecution and the fear and anxiety that these produced. Joris, by the way, was born in 1501 and died of natural causes, which was a rarity for his people, in 1556. As a result of the persecution, the terror, the running from here to there, separation from his wife and family and his growing number of children. I don't know how he was able to produce 11 children, because he and his wife were not together all that often. I suppose 11 times is all needed. But the terror that he experienced was behind his particular and very unusual theology and set of ideas. And one of the things he sought to do, and this became very clear, is how can I achieve calm, emotional calm and tranquility in this period of intense emotion. He wanted to rise above the fear of man, as he put it, and become at peace in the perfect fear of God. And then he developed a scheme where others could achieve this, he believed. And unlike the Puritans, who could never achieve a sense that they had reached a stage when they were certain, Joris offered his followers a place where they could feel they have reached this plateau and no longer needed to fear. While Joris and his Anabaptist colleagues were the most severely persecuted religious group in the first half of the century, Catholic and Lutheran polemicists happily published hate literature, as you see here, linking Anabaptists to the devil and to sedition. And you've got sort of the rhetoric in the image here. This is the devil. Now, okay, maybe this group of Anabaptists deserved it. They're laying seed. They had actually taken over the City Hall of Amsterdam. There were only about 60 of them. They're expecting a few hundred more. And then the city fathers had to lay siege to them. So the devil is behind this notorious Perigobers activity, the Anabaptist activity. And this is the result. Hundreds of Anabaptists were executed simply because they wanted to have a more intense, more biblical New Testament experience with their faith. Luther thought they were mad for their irrational beliefs and ecstatic behavior, and also for their willingness to die for their beliefs. And this confirmed for the Anabaptists that they were the persecuted children of God. So on both sides, there are these emotions of hate and anger, and also a desire to please God. Joris was the most despised individual. You probably have never heard of him before. No one's willing to admit to this. Yeah, I know who he is. He was, in his own day, he was the most despised individual. He had a price on his head. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V sent out agents. They had spies. They used all sorts of tricks to try and capture him, because he had become one of the leading members of this group, especially after the notorious Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster, about which I'm sure you've heard something. In 1534, 1535, this is when Joris joined the Anabaptist movement. He had already been expelled from his home city in 1528 for preaching out against veneration of the Virgin Mary, an image of the Virgin Mary. And returned back and eventually joined the Anabaptists, although he was terrified of doing that because he didn't want to be arrested again. There's just something about torture. You have it once, you don't want to face it again. When he joined the Anabaptist movement, he joined at a time of apocalyptical excitement, of people expecting Christ to return and the judgment to come. And this event in February 1535 in Amsterdam, people in their excitement threw off their clothes, burned them as material things of no use, and ran naked through the streets of Amsterdam, proclaiming the coming judgment of God. And this becomes attached to the image of the Anabaptist thereafter. Anabaptists associated with ecstatic behavior, with nudity, but there are only 11. It wasn't Anabaptist Munster fell in 1535, and then the government really cranked up the persecution thereafter to eradicate every single source of this irrational activity. We have murder accounts. We have letters written home to family and friends. We have records of people of Anabaptists speaking on the scaffold before their executions. No one has mined this material for the history of emotion. What are the feelings being expressed? I'll give you just one example, the story of these two young women. They were sisters-in-law in the eastern Netherlands, Maria and Ursula. These were actually two supporters of Joris and executed in 1544. The account as written by the supporters of these Anabaptist women is filled with the anger, the diabolically inspired anger of the prosecutors, and the patience, fear, and joy of these two women, and you can see this in this later 17th century print. Joy and peace is being portrayed as the emotions of the martyrs, and in some of them you actually do see the anger and hostility of the persecutors. The execution of these young noble women inspired further emotional responses. A number of their friends and family, calling themselves the children of Emmeline, were so enraged by this act that in late August 1548 they conducted a campaign of vengeance by stabbing livestock belonging to the nobility and committing acts of arson, especially on haystacks, leading to widespread fears of conspiratorial terrorist gangs. So you've got emotional responses and counter responses leading to actions and leading the government to alter its approach and leading both sides to change their ideas. Joris, during the time that he was in Holland, up until 1539, was on the run constantly. There was no place that was safe for him. He had to try and find a place where his wife and family, in 1539, both his wife was arrested by the authorities and his mother, who had been a major protector in the city of Delft for him. She was executed. His wife was mysteriously released, I suspect to be used as bait to get Joris to give himself up. And it nearly worked. The anxiety he felt over his wife's security and his children's security, who were put in the hands of strangers, and again used as bait to attract Joris to come and rescue them. It's just extraordinary. I can't imagine how he felt. Finally, in 1539, he finds refuge in the city of Antwerp, takes up with a couple noble families who become his major patrons and protectors, so that when his identity is discovered there in Antwerp in 1544, they move with him with their disposable income, considerable disposable income, to Basel in Switzerland in that year, where Joris died in 1556. He lived there under a pseudonym, so even though everyone knew he was sort of this Joris, they just pretended because they had lots of wealth. His writings, his behavior, his emotional state all change, obviously, when he achieves a place of calm and security. The biographer that recounts Joris's life up till his move to Antwerp says it focused on the inner spirit of this man. It describes Joris's turn to art. He was trained as an artist. He loved art rather than studying Latin. And so throughout his career, he despised higher education. He would not like us. Because we were the spirit of the letter. We were the letter rather than the spirit. And he thought very clearly in images, and this is apparently one of his early works. I've not seen it in person yet. And so this helps us understand. Of course, as an artist, he would have been trained in how to portray emotions, expressions on faces and using hand gestures. And he's really big on hand gestures. And so it was one of the markers of his work. In 1536, he more or less takes on leadership of the scattered remnants of the Anabaptists after the fall of Munster, and tries to pull people together, form compromises. Let's give up the sword, because Munster had been quite violent. And now he's in the leadership, he is now persecuted even more. The anxiety evidenced itself in physical symptoms, according to the biographer. There were moments when he could not be left alone, had to hide out. He felt temptation, of course, also sexual temptation, when he separated from his wife and hiding in close quarters with women followers. At one point, the biographer refers to him swallowing pills in order to calm his fears. I don't know what they were. I'd love to know, and what that did to him. And in this midst of terror, he is leading a movement and he is writing. And so we have a number of these early writings. Songs, for example, one of them he wrote while he was hiding in the bush behind an inn, while on the run. And when you read the song, you can see the emotion of fear and the hope, however, that God will intervene. He also experienced visions during this period of emotional disquiet and anxiety. Arduous prayer. In one, George suddenly stood enraptured as if he had left his body, so that he did not know if he was living or dead. He then saw a vision of the powerful and mighty bowing down in fear before the small and innocent children. And then, when he came to himself, he saw that the walls were filled with images of naked men and women, the latter in all sorts of shapes and postures, and he cried out, "Lord, Lord, I may indeed see everything." And he took this to mean that he could no longer be sexually aroused without a rational act, that he had achieved a state of perfection. So he's trying to balance, trying to overcome both sexual temptation, that kind of emotional feeling, and the fear of man at the same time. And one of his earliest works he wrote after this vision, and immediately picked up his quill and wrote a tract called Here, 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 Great Wonder, Great Wonder, Great Wonder, and describes his new scheme. It is an emotional work. It's not a work of logic, but it is like an announcement of this, he achieved this state. Also, apparently, these visions and the zeal would produce an inner warmth, so that even though he was hiding out in very cold places, he was kept alive. The Spirit would fall upon him, and he would fall down, prone, stumble around. But in all of this, he believed he had achieved the understanding of everything. And he wrote in his later works what he believed the whole world and universe, and especially in his book called The Wonder Book, the Book of Wonders. I'm not convinced by his explanations, but this is everything is internally focused for him. The inner spirit is all that matters, not the outer forms. As a fugitive, on the run, he didn't know how to complete his commissions. His artistic commissions became virtually impossible. He had to give up his craft and rely on followers for support. He was, as I said, one of the most hated individuals. His opponents, not just the Catholic Habsburg authorities or the Calvinists and others, but Jan van Battenberg, an Anabaptist who developed a small little terrorist gang, hated him because Joris was drawing his followers into his group so they could give up the sword and give up polygamy. And so this Battenberg, it's a photograph. So the hatred, the emotional feelings drove not only people from place to place, but shaped the way they thought and the positions they came to on a number of theological approaches. This is where he lived in Basel. They built this one, his family, his nobles, of course, and they bought this small little chateau inside the city. So his approach changes. He reaches a state of calm, his family is able to live with him again, and he begins writing, and you can tell very clearly the difference in his theology. Joris told his supporters how to achieve the kind of emotional state of calmness that he believed he had achieved. Everything is inner. This is a famous Dutch glass painter, Dirk Krabbe, who's clearly taken Joris's ideas. Here we see Jesus with a whole pile of people, but the old man, the devil, death, and sin up to the cross. This is very much Joris, the slaying of the old inner man versus the outer trappings of religion, which are of no use. He returned to illustrating, to his craft later on, to illustrate his ideas. These are just a couple of them, the stages in the move from youth, from childhood to full adulthood, and then the water of life, the fountain of life. This is the one with the Holy Spirit. This is his depiction of the new man. It's an inner transformation of the inner state, because the outer trappings are of no consequence. This is the Trinity, God the Father, the Most High, God, namely Christ. Here is the heart, and the high power of God, or the Spirit of life, is male genitalia. I've yet to work that out entirely, but very clearly that there's a sexual power thing. As I say, he's one of the strangest visuals, but he's thinking in images rather than in using logic. But you look at the face of this individual, calmness, tranquility, and he believed once he had reached certainly Antwerp and Basel, that he would achieve this state of control over his emotions. This is a portrait of him, famous for his red beard, recognizable even 3 years after his death, apparently, because of that red beard. And here, it's the look of love that he has told the painter to portray, because he's pointing at this scene over here over his shoulder of the Good Samaritan. That's the latest perspective of this. I'm trying to pass the evil eye, but I don't. And here's a work attributed to him, charity, and again, sort of calm resolution. That's not particularly unusual. The fear of God was something he really focused on, believing that he had achieved full understanding of the fear of God, which overcomes the fear of man, that he was no longer terrified of humans. And one of the things that he did, and I'm going to conclude with this, one of his most infamous opinions and positions was about the devil. He lived at the time of the revival of witch hunts across Europe in the Holy Roman Empire. He saw it rising. He said the devil, like angels, like anything else, there is no real physical devil outside of the human. The devil is merely the inner evil drive or desires, forcing you to return to the old Adam instead of the new man, which you saw depicted. And so the result is you should not fear witchcraft. And he writes to a follower who asks, should I fear being harmed by witchcraft? He says, no. Lutherans should say no, he says, but they don't go far enough because they're stuck to the letter. I say, even if you are harmed, your body or your property is harmed by witchcraft, that's of no consequence because it cannot touch your inner soul or spirit. Well, just to conclude, this is just one example of how the Reformation, the conflicts, the ideas that developed, the way people acted and lived, examples of that too, were driven by not just thinking clearly and sanely on issues and arguing over them, but by the emotions. And Joris, in particular, developed a whole scheme of spiritual development because he was trying to overcome the terror through which he was living. And I'll stop there. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
So, some questions, please. Who would like to ask a question? Yes.
And thank you both. But I think the question is probably to the first paper. I was interested in the role of this state or governments, are there shifts in that role that makes a difference in these three ways of the expulsion?
Yeah, I think that the state's involved in every one. So certainly, when you have the expulsions of Jews from towns and cities in Germany in the 15th century, that's being done by communal governments. But then it moves up to the royal government in Spain and Iberia. And I think the expulsions in the early part of the 15th century are often certainly states are involved, but as they get bigger, it's more you see that the expulsions can become as large as they are because the apparatus of the state is becoming as large as it is. And so I see them working together. That you need a larger state to have a larger expulsion, and it's a larger state with a greater commitment now to religious homogeneity that also then is driven to expel people. And I think that's where this does tie into the expansion of states and state powers. Certainly, I mean, it's very clear in the re-Catholicization campaigns that are active in Eastern Europe, but it's also very much evident in the work of the British state, the English state in England itself and in Ireland. So I don't think you can say that it's something that's characteristic of one side or the other. It's quite common. And what I also try to do in the book then is bring in the Ottoman example, because they also are engaged in large-scale movements of populations and targeting populations for certain areas. So I think it's very much tied to state power.
Thank you very much for the two stimulating papers. Just following on to the last question, amidst the vast range of emotions that you've traversed and illustrated, trying to Marxist-like, trying to seek a dominant paradigm, could I put it to you that perhaps a dominant motivation is greed by the persecuting classes? Because the expulsions they're not commonly associated with seizures of property. And one can trace a numerous range of examples, the Cathars in France, Henry VIII to the monasteries, etc., to the Germans and the Jewish persecution of the Nazis. They're after property, and they stimulate and find false causes to persecute these people and seize their property. They can evoke a further emotion among the common people, namely jealousy and suspicion of the mysterious other, these Jews who do funny things in synagogues and blah blah blah. This deadly combination, stimulated by ruling classes, state powers if you like, and capturing these popular and mobilizing these popular emotions to a horrendous extent. Is that a dominant paradigm?
I'd say it's there. Whether it's dominant or not, I think there's a couple of things that, to follow this, then we'd have to explain some counterproductive actions. So, for instance, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in the initial wave of the 1490s. The Ottoman Sultan is very happy to let the Jews settle in the Ottoman lands, because he can't understand why the Spanish king is getting rid of some of his most productive members of society. You do get a certain amount of gold, but it's human capital, and the Ottomans are aware of the value of human capital. And there's a number of cases where you see that there are distinctions being made between, say, human and physical capital. So even the expulsions in German towns in the 15th century, what often happens is that they're not expelled entirely, they're just expelled outside the walls. There's a sense of what the pure space of the walls demarks, and so we can't have Jews in there. But we don't want to lose their investment, so we allow them to settle in the suburbs and come in and work on market days, but then they have to leave by nightfall. And that's also then how ghettos work, where Jews have to return to the ghetto, like in Venice, Jews have to return to the ghetto by nightfall, but during the day they can work in the city. So the ways that cities operate often try to understand that there is an economic resource here that they want to maintain, and those people who don't maintain it are seen as shooting themselves in the foot, as a series of Iberian kings are seen that way by others in Europe. So I think it's absolutely a factor. I think in some areas we see it operating more clearly than others. But I wouldn't want to say that it's the dominant one. I mean, I think I like you see that we have to take these material considerations absolutely into effect. And so, while not following the entire Marxist paradigm, I certainly see that it's very persuasive in a lot of ways. But this is something that's just there are points where people act against their economic interest, and where states act against their economic interest, and that's, I think, an intriguing thing we have to look at.
And part of that is the fear of God overwhelming all other emotional reactions. If you're afraid that God is going to send a flood or a storm or destroy your community just because you have a few Mennonites among you that have to be uprooted, or the witches later on, then you will make decisions that apparently that may not be in your best economic interest as a community. So it was a very powerful feeling.
I just have a question about the Anabaptists or Mennonites. My question would be, is there any other factor that the conventional Protestant churches such as Lutherans, especially Calvinists, is there any reason why they persecute Mennonites rather than just religious and the doctrine reasons rather than that? Yeah.
Why they couldn't just get along?
Yeah. And also persecuting Mennonite, making the alliance with the Catholic, which they blame like the kind of Satan. Yeah.
There are a number of factors. One has to do with the Protestants. The Calvin and Luther saw them as sectarians. They're dividing from us, and so you can't tolerate them for that because you don't want even more splits in the Protestant movement. But I think more profound is the fact that they were the only group that rejected infant baptism, and I think here you're dealing with the emotion of fear on the part of parents. What happens if your children are not baptized right away? And not only you're afraid of your children going to hell if they die, and death rates are very high for children, but what happens when you've got all of these unbaptized people? And remember, as part of most of certainly the Catholic ceremony, there's an exorcism prior to baptism. So in some of the rhetorical literature against the Anabaptists, because they're not baptizing children, we've got demons now inhabiting children and running around and doing nasty things. So there are sort of what we would describe as rational fears, and then there's the theological disputes. Catholics demonize the Anabaptists most and prosecute them the most. And if you look at the numbers, most of the executions of Anabaptists are in Catholic lands because these are the most radical rejectors of the Catholic system. Lutherans next. It's a clear hierarchy. Why? Because Lutherans are sort of a halfway house on the sacraments between Catholics and Reformed, so they reject the Anabaptists. Calvinists, depending on where you are, some Reformed, some Calvinists also prosecuted Anabaptists. Others just wanted to talk to them as erring brothers. And that was certainly true in the Dutch Republic. So you have variations, shades of opposition, but none of them really wanted Anabaptists around. And you're afraid God is going to punish you because these are blasphemers.
Just sort of thinking as a theologian for a second, I'm curious how we might actually locate the doctrinal shifts in relation to the emergence of nationalism, because it seems to me that what you get in Calvin and Luther is something politically quite complex in the way that the doctrine of election is being constructed. So for Calvin, it seems almost that it's a way of saying you cannot know whether you are elected. And so, towards the end of the institutes, you get this longing to be reunited with the Roman Catholic Church. And in Luther, particularly early on, you get this very interesting theology of the cross, where God is somehow located in and amidst death and suffering. But then, of course, through the 17th century, which is where you're locating a lot of these ships, I wonder what's going on in post-Westphalian doctrinal constructions that's actually generating a kind of other in the gradual alliance between doctrine and nationalism, and to the point where you get in the 19th century very ugly kind of religious histories in Prussia. So anyway, I'm just kind of curious how you're locating that ship.
I mean, it's not a study that deals deeply with doctrinal texts, but tries to look at how doctrinal texts might be used, and that's where, say, so it wouldn't be so much, say, the writings of somebody like a Calvin or a Luther, but more the catechisms and the confessions that come up, and so the way that those catechisms and confessions become much more, on one hand, they become much more lengthy and much more detailed. And on the other, the point that's of interest to me is how they become used as in a sense, the markers of engagement within the political community. So that it's not even so much whether you believe it or not believe it. It's just you have to swear allegiance to it. And that's the part that's the part that I'm working at. So it's not even so much how the theology itself is changing, say, in the seminaries or even in the pulpits, but how governments find it advantageous to shape an identity that relies very heavily on these religious texts as ways of legitimating the actions that they're undertaking. And I think that at that point, I mean, that's why you can get, it seems to me, an increasing confessionalism, even though the actual levels of faith are not necessarily going up, right? It's not like we're having an evangelical revival in the 18th century in some of these areas, the way you have in the 19th century. But it's almost, these things become more utilitarian as faith fades. And then I think it's more a process across the 18th and into the 19th century where there's a transmigration that what you find, the forms of identity that are important religiously will become ones that tie to the folk, to the nation, and then to race later on. So in the book I try to, in the last chapter is a bit of a gallop, but I try to make that shift then, that it goes from a kind of sense religious nationalism towards more Volkish nationalism, towards racial nationalism. Again, trying to give a sense to a reader now who might have some of the modern genocides and expulsions in mind, where this, how this connects. And I'm not trying to say the old hoary thing about there being a straight line between Luther and Hitler. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I don't want to get into that debate necessarily, but there is a way in which, the thing that's always interested me has been civic religion as opposed to, say, ecclesiastical creeds. And so I'm interested in seeing how people have used religion within civic and social settings. And a lot of it ends up being, this matter of, again, the imaginary, or points of ownership, identity, the creation of an imagined community, or the creation of a kind of a confessional group. And I think that's the kind of thing, again, one of the things when the Archbishop of Salzburg forces these Protestants out of the area around Salzburg, people think it's a crazy thing to do, because he's beggaring himself. These are productive farmers, determinedly Protestant, but a weird Protestantism. Other Protestants really don't know what to make of them and don't particularly want to have them around, because they've kind of developed their own way of surviving under generations by that point of Jesuit assault. So it's a bit of a strange Protestantism they have, with a lot of Catholic elements in it, oddly enough. That's why when they go up to Calvinist Prussia, they're not in as much trouble, but it ain't no paradise there either. So it's shifting, right? And so what I'm really looking at is the utilitarian political social side. I don't know if that answers the question. I think it's a legitimate question. Yeah, I'm not really capable of answering it.
I'm just kind of curious as a theologian, because I feel like we could do more doctrinally to actually see what's going on in the theological texts themselves is beginning to obsoleteness.
Sounds
Yeah,
like
no,
a good
I-
collaboration. Sounds
Yeah,
like something
that would be
that,
I've been given a limit of
all the
100,000
theologians,
words.
yeah, call up, ready to die of theologians. So thank you very much for that, Christian. And in fact, we may have to let our speakers maybe have that cup of tea, and all of you as well, and hopefully direct some more questions to them over that cup of tea. We've run over time, and what the hell? As long as we're not sent to hell, as some of these reformers, I think, would be pretty sure that we would be destined to it. But let's go and have a cup of tea instead, and thank our speakers.